accusing President Putin of rebuffing calls for even a ceasefire.
Let's turn to the European Union because they have agreed more sanctions against Russia over its war against Ukraine.
Something is going very wrong in Russia. Not just on the front lines, but for Putin and Russian mothers. Russia's war in Ukraine is now being measured not only on the front lines, but also in cold, hard numbers. As we enter the summer of 2025, the Kremlin's tally, based on official and independent data, stands at 1.1 million casualties. This figure not only reflects military casualties, but also reveals how rapidly Russia's human resource reserves are being depleted and how Putin's army is nearing the limits of sustainability. The most critical question arises here. Can Russia compensate for these losses by deploying 30 to 35,000 new troops to the front lines each month, or has the system already collapsed? Data from the past year provides a harsh answer to this question. The average daily loss is around 1,200, which amounts to 36,000 soldiers per month. This figure, which nearly matches the Kremlin's claimed influx of new troops, indicates that the army is constantly stuck at the zero line. In other words, thousands of new soldiers sent to the front each month are being eliminated at the same rate. The equation is locked at zero, and the system cannot expand. To maintain this flow, the Kremlin has established an unprecedented incentive mechanism. Signing bonuses have been increased to 400,000 rubles, and in Moscow and its surroundings, this figure has risen to between 1 and 2 million rubles. Some soldiers stepped onto the front lines with a package worth up to 5 million rubles in their first year. The monthly salary of a contracted soldier has reached 210,000 rubles, with additional payments on the ground. This figure is several times higher than in the civilian sector. However, this cannot be explained solely by the power of money. The Kremlin also tied the law to the front lines. Regulations issued in the fall of 2024 gave defendants in criminal cases or suspects who had not yet been convicted the opportunity to avoid punishment by signing a contract. This created a constant flow from prisons and investigation files to the front lines. When demographic pressures are added to this picture, the picture becomes even clearer. Russia's unemployment rate stands at 2.5%, meaning the labor market is nearly fully employed. Every new soldier sent to the front is essentially a worker pulled out of the economy. Average wages appear to be rising, with a 15% increase recorded between April and May 2025. However, this is not due to increased productivity, but rather to incentives pumped into the economy to recruit soldiers for the front lines. In other words, Russia's artificial wage increase is actually a byproduct of the war economy. All these mechanisms are working for now, but they cannot hide the reality of losses on the ground. Because deaths alone do not explain the full picture. A significant portion of the wounded cannot return to the front lines. Open source analyses indicate that between 30 and 40% of those seriously wounded are permanently unable to return to combat. This demonstrates that official figures are more optimistic than the reality on the ground. Another critical issue is the growing number of desertions and acts of insubordination within the military. Over 20,000 cases were filed between the end of 2022 and the summer of 2025. Most of these cases were filed under the charge of leaving the unit without permission. Courts typically suspend sentences and send soldiers back to the front lines. Thus, discipline appears to be maintained on paper. However, in practice, there is a growing perception among soldiers that even if I am punished, I will end up back at the front. This feeling is deepening the moral collapse. The failure to implement rotation in a healthy manner is also exacerbating the situation. Normally, troops should be withdrawn for rest after a certain period of time, but due to high casualties, soldiers are being kept on the front lines continuously. Fatigue and psychological collapse are reducing the army's efficiency and increasing casualties. The fact that a significant portion of those sent to the front lines come from ethnic minority regions is creating additional unrest. Casualties from regions such as Dagestan, Buryatia, and Yakutia are disproportionately high. The growing silent protests at funerals in these regions are not going unnoticed, despite pressure from the Kremlin. The problem facing the Russian army today is not just a matter of cold numbers, it is also a moral collapse. Soldiers are exhausted, society is impoverished, and the Kremlin is trying to maintain stability through money, repression, and the bending of the law. However, thousands of soldiers entering the system each month are disappearing at the same rate. The equation remains at zero, and this is unsustainable. Moreover, what is keeping Russia's war in Ukraine afloat is not just the number of soldiers but the massive budget needed to support them. However, this budget is becoming increasingly fragile. In the first half of 2025, personnel costs alone exceeded 2 trillion rubles. By the end of the year, this figure is projected to reach 4 trillion rubles. This amounts to approximately 2% of the country's gross domestic product and nearly 1/10 of federal expenditures. In other words, 1 out of every 10 government expenditures is directly used to send soldiers to the front lines. Calculating the cost of a single soldier alone makes the picture clear. A soldier signing a contract receives an average bonus of 1.5 million rubles. With 35,000 soldiers, this amounts to 50 billion rubles per month just for signing bonuses. On top of this, each soldier receives a monthly salary of 210,000 rubles. The cost grows cumulatively due to the additional burden on the budget each month from new recruits. Upon discharge, death benefits come into play. The compensation paid to a soldier's family ranges from 5 million rubles at the federal level to up to 14 million rubles with regional supplements. This item accounted for 6% of the budget in 2024. The ratio is expected to grow further in 2025 due to increased losses. For Russia, the problem is not only the size of these figures, but also their impact on the civilian economy. Education, healthcare, agriculture, and infrastructure investments are being cut due to this burden. Small businesses are going bankrupt under high interest rates and inflation. The public is struggling to access basic food products. While the situation is relatively mild in cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the burden of the war is directly reflected in household expenses in rural areas. While soldiers at the front are receiving millions in bonuses, ordinary Russian citizens are buying bread in single-slice packages. Another factor exacerbating this budgetary pressure is the sanctions imposed by the West. In particular, secondary sanctions were expanded starting from the end of 2024. Russia's access to critical military components has become more difficult. Backdoor supply chains established through China, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan are operational, but the cost of each component has increased 3 to 4 times. An electronic component that would normally cost $100 now costs $300 to $400 when sourced through these channels. In other words, the Kremlin can now produce significantly less military equipment with the same amount of rubles. The military industry is also struggling. At the beginning of 2024, Russia could produce approximately 100 new tanks per month. By the summer of 2025, this number had dropped to between 30 and 35. This is not solely due to sanctions, it is also because the pace of tank losses in the war cannot be matched. British intelligence reports indicate that Russia has lost over 4,000 tanks since the start of the war, equivalent to 1/3 of its total tank fleet. Today, Russia's tank production capacity cannot compensate for these losses. The situation is similar in air defense systems. Electronic components required for the S-300 and S-400 systems in particular were largely imported. With the supply chain disrupted, it has become nearly impossible to upgrade these systems. Ukraine's technological superiority further exacerbates the situation. At the start of the war, Russia relied on its numerical superiority. However, over the past 2 years, Ukraine has shifted the balance with high-precision munitions from the West and its own drone tactics. FPV drone swarms have targeted tanks and armored vehicles on the front lines, increasing casualties. HIMARS batteries have continuously struck Russian logistics. ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles have hit Russia's rear lines. Electronic warfare systems frequently disabled Russian military communication networks. As a result, every new soldier sent to the front by the Kremlin faces a more technological, organized, and agile enemy. The nature of the losses has changed. Soldiers are no longer being killed by artillery fire alone, but by precision strikes, drone attacks, and coordinated missile raids. This explains why casualties remain at the same rate. No matter how much money the Kremlin pumps in or how many soldiers it finds, it has lost its technological superiority on the battlefield. As Russia's economy and military industry struggle to support its manpower, the balance of power in the war becomes increasingly fragile. Soldiers are being sent to the front with bonuses, but the tanks, missiles, and defense systems to equip them are dwindling. Sanctions are increasing costs 3 to 4 times, Ukraine, on the other hand, is constantly wearing down the Russian army with lower cost but more effective tactics.